Ja, och då presenterar vi och välkomnar Ian Giles på scenen. Vi har hört lite grann om att det brukar finnas ekonomiska motiv bakom den nordiska litteraturens framgångar i utlandet, till exempel i Tyskland. Jag inbillar mig att det kommer handla lite grann om ekonomiska motiv nu också. Ja. Välkommen, jag hoppas att du kan...
Tack, ja alltså mitt forskningsområde är Storbritannien och mitt forskningsspråk är engelska, så jag tänker hålla föredrag på engelska, men det går så bra med frågor på skandinaviska i efterhand om ni så önskar. Speaking in 2008, one of the research pioneers in the study of the British reception of Scandinavian literature, Peter Graves, noted the remarkable absence of a coherent historical account of the transmission of Scandinavian literature to Britain, adding that it still waits to be done. And it was apparent that there was a necessity to conduct a comprehensive descriptive study of the transmission of Scandinavian literature and its reception in the UK. Apparent especially to me in 2013 when I was seeking inspiration for a doctoral project in Scandinavian studies at the University of Edinburgh. Now I've finished that thesis. I'm currently waiting to defend it next month, and I'd like to think I've gone some way in responding to Graves' challenge to Scandinavian scholars, but as is always the case, there's definitely still lots of work to be done. My PhD features 5 case studies from the past 100 years, one of which is Danish, 2 are Norwegian, and 2 are Swedish. And these are respectively Agnar Mykle, Peter Hög's Miss Smiller's Feeling for Snow, Homson's Growth of the Soil, Agnar Mykle's 4 Ash Burleyfoot novels, Sjöwall and Wahler's Martin Beck Ecology, and the Millennium series by Stig Larsson. Now these case studies, as you may well tell, vary in terms of their extent, their genre, their era, and the impact of the authors in each case varies quite dramatically as well. So in the case of Homson, he has, despite a rather challenging personal legacy, been canonized in Britain as something of a literary classic. And it would appear that Sjöwall and Wahler are gradually assuming a similar status, at least in the world of crime fiction, while the legacies of writers like Hög and Larsson remain unresolved. Mykle, in contrast, has largely been forgotten beyond the borders of Norway. Given that Britain is a country where publishers, critics and readers have traditionally refused to engage with translated literature, the current golden age of translation, which is statistically proven right now, I should add, fueled by, amongst other places, Scandinavia, has seemingly emerged from nowhere over the last quarter of a century or so. Of course, it's not the first time this has happened. The 19th century saw the enthusiastic translation of writers such as Ibsen and Strindberg, as well as the sagas. Very much the kinds of things that Kian was telling us about in his paper a little bit earlier on with the fascination with Romanticism. Contemporary accounts of the current wave of Scandinavian translation in Britain have tended to equate Scandinavia only with the genre of crime fiction, although there's clearly rather more to it than that, given the current vogue in Britain not just for Nordic noir, but for Scandinavian horror, see Jon Ajvide Lindqvist, autofiction in the form of Knausgård, non-fiction in the form of writers like Elisabeth Åsbrink and Lars Mytting. And that's, just a few names that I picked off the top of my head. And that's before we even look at wider cultural exports and trends on the telly, IKEA, Hygge, etc., etc. Now, Nordic noir is, of course, undeniably central to the current popularity of Scandinavian literature in Britain, and it's something I will touch upon and have talked about on a previous visit to Lund. However, as Kim Toft Hansen and Anna-Marit Vorder point out in their recent book on the subject, it's very difficult to tell what Nordic noir actually is. With that in mind, and bearing in mind that Robert Zola Christensen is going to tell us all about it in a couple of hours' time, I won't dwell on the subject for too long. So 100 years is a very long time, but what I'm going to attempt to do right now is see you through to your sandwiches by outlining a few trends that we can observe over the past century in terms of selling books, drawing in particular on my thesis case studies, as well as publishing themes we can identify more generally when considering what it takes to sell Scandinavian literature to British readers. So first things first, hype. There's always been a need for an author backstory, as well as a source market publisher who can generate appropriate publicity in order to influence the selection of books for transmission and subsequent success. If you don't have that in the source market, then how will books ever leave for translation in the first place? However, over the past century, the performance of books in other foreign markets prior to their arrival in the UK has also become increasingly important in selecting Scandinavian books for transmission. A recent case in point being the Millennium books by Larsson, which only gained widespread traction in multiple foreign markets, such as the French and Spanish markets, once it had been demonstrated it was possible to sell the series to readers in Germany. And only then did it make it into English. So very much what Monica has just been talking to us about German as the Tor zur Welt. Similarly, Henning Mankell's entry to the Anglophone market came via Germany. Looking back, there was British media interest in Agnar Mykla's trial and subsequent book ban in Norway, and there was just as much interest in Britain in his legal and censorship difficulties elsewhere, for example in Sweden and Finland, with reports appearing in the Times and the Daily Telegraph. Of course, this tendency towards exports from Scandinavia to Britain via a third country isn't absolute. In the case of, for instance, Höeg's Miss Smiller, the English language translation is actually the first foreign edition of the novel to be published after the original Danish, and it sort of very much leads the way in the international reception of both Smiller and Höeg as a writer. Novelty value is another thing that can be very, very useful in pitching Scandinavian books to British readers. If you don't have novelty value, then perhaps you want to bring very high levels of esteem, as was the case with Hamsun. In the case of Sjöwall and Waller, there was the initial novelty of them writing as a couple, later superseded by Waller's early death, which led to quite a number of critical hagiographies of him. And similarly, Stieg Larsson being published posthumously lent weight to the marketing efforts thanks to novelty. Publishing a full trilogy by a dead author is really quite unusual. And indeed, there's been quite a lot of work done here in Lund that suggests that in celebrity author culture, being prematurely dead is one of the best marketing tools available to you. Peter Höeg, meanwhile, has on the one hand been portrayed as a beautiful eccentric to the British. I tried to pick a beautiful photo of him here, whilst also having his credentials as a literary award winner pushed as well. And Agnar Mykle opted for the approach of combining frank descriptions of sex in his works with appearing in the Norwegian literary trial of the century, leading him to be portrayed to the British as a sex-crazed, censored, proper novelist. Not consistent, but certainly novel, I'm sure you'll agree. Following the collapse of the net book agreement price-fixing structure in the 1990s in Britain, we've also seen the rise of the bestseller, or perhaps the rebirth of the bestseller, into the mega seller. These stratospheric bestsellers are easier to generate hype around in both source and target markets, and generate a snowball effect on sales and consumption amongst readers. In short, a book that sells lots of copies will probably sell lots more copies. And in the cases of writers like Höeg and Larsson, marketing of their books and resultant press coverage focused extensively on the number of copies sold. Smiller is regularly cited as having sold in excess of 1 million books in Britain, while the Millennium trilogy, the originals, have sold over 6 million in the UK. A bestseller requires a large print run to facilitate mass sales, and even the order of a large print run has become a marketing ploy. Press releases from 10 years ago from McElhoe's Press regarding the impending paperback release of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo focused on the number of copies in the print run. And this is very much the development of a type of hype where people buy books, where we're moving from people buying books because other people are buying books to a publisher announcing beforehand that lots of people will be buying the books, therefore encouraging people to do so. And what we see with this is an interesting ripple effect, thanks to these highly successful Scandinavian books arriving in Britain. In the case of Hamsun, this ripple effect was reflected in the determination to translate every book that he'd ever written into English. In the case of Höeg, as I'll mention a little bit later, it caused the emergence of a weather book genre. Most recently, Stieg Larsson's British success has seen more books originating in Scandinavia being translated, reviewed and sold than we've ever had before. Larsson has developed a demand amongst British readers for Scandinavian books, especially in the crime and thriller genre, that has generated a very big gap in our literary system that's been filled by a glut of new imports. So it's resulted in the discovery of new bestsellers like Jo Nesbø, Jonas Jonasson and Fredrik Backman. I'm sorry if you're not happy about the kinds of Scandinavian books we're consuming in Britain, but that's just the facts. And this mainstreaming of Scandinavian literature in the British literary system also, for example, paved the way for the David Lagercrantz reboot of Millennium to soar to success. So the 2016 paperback edition of Lagercrantz's first Millennium outing in English translation was actually the best-selling translated book in Britain that year. So we now see in statistical terms that when we combine the Scandinavian languages, Scandinavia is the third most common source language for translated fiction being published in the UK since the turn of the century. Of course, it would be remiss to ignore the TV. The reception of Scandinavian books in Britain has increasingly been influenced by the prominence of imported Scandinavian telly in the UK over the past decade. The impact of TV imports has removed the taboo of the word foreign in the sale of translated literature, with some consumers becoming far more open-minded as a result. The success of subtitled primarily Danish shows such as Forbrydelsen, Brun and Born, broadcast as prime weekend viewing, albeit on the rather niche channel BBC4, has fueled a second wave of Scandinavian crime fiction in translation since about 2010. And this reflects the somewhat cyclical multimodal nature of modern cultural consumption. Hansen and Vorder argue that the success of shows such as The Killing is grounded on the past success of Scandinavian crime fiction, and yet it's feeding back into more books. And more remarkable has been the flourishing of a British production line of directly influenced television products like the BBC production of Wallander, as well as the big-budget Sky production Fortitude. Hansen and Vorder believe that the key to this lies in the Nordic setting, and that in fact plots and characters have very much become a secondary issue. But moving on to my big point about what it takes to sell Scandinavian books in particular to British readers, I think that a very strong selling factor for Scandi books in the UK is the use of genre fiction, but in particular the use of genre hybridity. In the 1920s, we saw the emergence of genres for the first time in sort of popular and commercial terms to categorize literature, with what we now call genre fiction, such as crime or sci-fi, rapidly being confined to the margins in favor of other proper literature. And over the last century or so, we've seen that form of genre fiction moving slowly towards the centre of the British literary system again, to the extent that scholars like Clive Bloom believe that the boundaries between what we might call legitimate fiction and genre fiction have now collapsed. The case studies in my thesis demonstrate that translated fiction can be seen to be offering innovation in this regard, highlighting the need for genre fiction solutions to the needs of the British literary system, not to mention the needs of British publishers who tend to rely on genre fiction to make a profit in order to subsidise the rest of their lists. But this emergence of hybrid genres and subgenres that combine different forms and styles to draw new readers to them and fulfilling new requirements in the literary system is something that's worth focusing on. Peter Höeg's Smilla, for instance, took the use of hybrid genre to a new level. The novel was a combination of thriller and elite fiction, arguably with side servings of post-colonialism and science fiction. And despite this, the reception of the book often sees its literary credentials emphasised over its genre fiction features, which was probably reinforced by the post-colonial dimension. meaning that it not only appealed to the sensibilities of British readers in the early 1990s, but it was seen as being a serious book that was worthy of attention. In the case of Smiller, it wasn't just the use of hybrid genre that contributed to its successful reception. There was attention being drawn actively to this hybridity in the marketing of the book at the time, when it wasn't really possible to market a book solely on the basis of being a Scandinavian novel on its own. Smiller had a very central position in the British literary system, and arguably it still remains a key work. Höeg has been adopted into the British polysystem, although his position is gradually diminishing as time passes from his seminal work, as follow-ups have failed to live up to that commercial or critical success. In straightforward terms, subsequent Höeg novels didn't engage with post-colonialism, they didn't adopt the same hybrid genre approach again, and sales are flagged as his books were frankly considered rather odd. Identifying whether he had a substantial impact on the position of Scandinavian literature more generally can be a little challenging. On the one hand, there's a clear endeavour to find other Peter Höegs in the mid-1990s, seen in the publication of writers such as Pernille Rygg, Herbjørg Wassmo and Kerstin Ekman. In fact, the failure by Ekman's British publisher in the mid-90s, Chatto and Windus, to capitalise on her as the next Höegesque bestseller seems a little bit short-sighted. Jakob Storgård Nielsen sees Smiller and Ekman's Blackwater as being literary equals, and while the eco-criticism that you find in Blackwater is a little bit different from Höeg's post-colonialism, Helena Forshaw-Scott has argued that other works by Ekman, such as the Wolfskin trilogy, do engage with post-colonialism. You can't help but feel that a marketing opportunity was missed with Ekman. Moving on, the publication of other works by Höeg himself meant, of course, that Scandinavian books were enjoying more releases, sales and press coverage than in previous decades during the 90s. Ergo, there was a position of centrality for Scandinavian literature. On the other hand, the receptivity of British readers to Smiller was perhaps less to do, as I've noted, with the Scandinavian origins, and more to do with this hybridity, this weather book subgenre, imbued with a degree of literary sophistication whilst also being fairly accessible to readers. A form of zeitgeist-driven rainy post-colonialism, then. Given that the writers who followed in Höeg's footsteps in this rather niche area were writers like David Gutterson and Annie Proulx, it's perhaps more justifiable to state that Höeg in fact drew a certain brand of transatlantic book towards the centre of Britain's literary system, rather than Scandinavian books on their own. Notwithstanding this, Smiller remains important, it continues to sell respectably, continues to be read, and it's frequently mentioned in both popular cultural terms in Britain, and it's still used as a literary benchmark by a lot of comparative literature scholars. In the case of the Millennium series, the hybrid approach adopted differed to what we find in Smiller. While both were published in periods of societal uncertainty and unrest in the UK, the concerns of British readers differed somewhat between the early 90s and the late 2000s. Readers in the early 90s might have been interested in post-colonial issues set against a backdrop of pre-millennial angst, but readers 10 years ago were frankly rather more concerned about their financial futures. And so in the case of Millennium, we find that this original trilogy is very much an example of a thriller crossed with crunch lit, another hybrid genre. And this only works in the British reception of the books, as crunch lit is a genre concerning the events around the British financial crisis of 07-08. Written in the early 2000s by Larsson, a decade after Sweden's financial crisis in the early 90s, Larsson clearly couldn't have been predicting that we would have a credit crunch in 2007 in Britain. So it's rather an example of an inadvertent hybrid. But Larsson's hybridity continues in terms of the way that his work appeals to readers in form and style. His background interest in science fiction means that beyond the obvious fact that as huge bestsellers, these books appeal to many readers who might not otherwise typically engage with Scandinavian translations or crime fiction, the books have a specific hybrid readership by borrowing readers who might typically read books with a slightly more fantasy or sci-fi driven style, or even appealing to readers with Gothic tastes, which is very much a story for another day. And this is combined into this hybrid genre to become something of a hybrid that really appealed to British readers just in the late 2000s. So it was a very potent import. And the timeliness of this literary transmission is possibly best observed in the reception of David Lagercrantz's follow-ups, numbers 4 and 5, which came out in 2015 and last year, which they have done very well, but they haven't lived up to the success of the originals. Gone is a lot of the hybridity in genre terms, with Crunchlit obviously having a rather limited shelf life, and it is no longer applicable to the concerns of British readers in the present day. What we have seen since 2016, of course, is the emergence of Brexlit, but we'll talk about that another time. That these forms of hybrid genres have become the establishment norm working for both British readers and publishers is clear. In an interview with the trade publication Svensk Bokhandel last October, Stieg Larsson's British publisher Christopher McElhose complained that Brits weren't interested in reading proper literature, they were only interested in watching football. Despite McElhose's sterling work on behalf of Scandinavian literature in Britain, Stieg Larsson, Jon Esbø, Henning Mankell, P.O. Enquist, Torgny Lindgren, Jakob Ejersbo is just some of the names I sketched down that he's published. It's a little bit disingenuous of him to say that, given the success he's enjoyed with writers such as Henning Mankell, as well as especially Stieg Larsson, whose Millennium series would be considered genre fiction by the standards of most. And to some extent, the fact that McElhose considers Larsson to be proper literature demonstrates the extent to which hybrid genre literature has become an acceptable part of the literary mainstream in recent decades in Britain. Publisher Ellie Steele, one of McElhose's successors at Harvill Secker, suggests that publishers have become increasingly inclined to acquire foreign works and to look beyond the most common genres when importing, which seems very plausible to me and indicates again that hybridity plays a role. And another McElhose acolyte, Paul Engels, suggests that what we're seeing is a crossover effect, at least in terms of Scandinavian literature, with the bolstering of niche subgenres or hybrids. And he seems to be particularly focused on writers like Jonas Jonasson and Fredrik Backman there. So what we see is that Nordic noir itself is effectively typified by hybridity. And this perhaps explains why it's so hard to define what it is and why it moves across the boundaries of media so easily. There are no hard and fast rules on what it uses in its hybrid form. In the case of Smiller, we have our progenesis of the transatlantic post-colonial weather book in the guise of a highbrow crime novel and sci-fi page-turner, while Millennium is effectively a credit crunch lit book crossed with crime and thrillers with gothic stylistic overtones. And this is illustrative of the approach that can be found in successful imports more generally of Scandinavian literature over the past century to Britain. And it's increasingly the benchmark by which new prospects are being measured. The Scandinavian propensity towards hybrid genres when producing literature has made Scandinavian literature increasingly appealing to British readers in the last few years, and consequently, of course, to British publishers. And this in turn makes readers likelier to tackle further Scandinavian translations, so it's all self-fulfilling. And this may go some way in explaining McElhose's assertion to Svensk Bokhandel that the era of the Scandinavian crime novel is over, and that British readers, while remaining wary of translations in general, are now demanding brilliant writers rather than specific genres. I'd argue that what they're in fact demanding are new, innovative, hybrid literary products, and that it's Scandinavia that is able to provide these. Thank you very much.
Tack ska du ha, Ian. Vi hinner kanske med en fråga innan vi ska äta lunch. Vi kommer nog att ha en liten paneldiskussion och så också i slutet av dagen, så att det blir möjligt att ställa frågor vid senare tillfälle också. Men finns det någon redan nu kanske som skulle vilja fråga? Ja, Åsa?
Det var jätteintressant. Jag undrar om du vill säga någonting om översättningens roll, översättarnas roll. Det var ju en diskussion efter den första millenniumboken i Sverige att den var så mycket bättre på engelska. Det är någonting som händer. Att också skillnaderna mellan de här verken lite slätas ut för att översättningarna sätter dem liksom på en...
Ja, vi skulle ju kunna... översättarens roll är väldigt, väldigt viktig, och man kan konstatera att på det allmänna att nordisk litteratur till engelska världen, som jag är mest bekant med, så har översättaren numera en stor roll att spela, och de har tillfälle att bli involverad på ett sätt som kanske översättare från andra språk inte har, på grund av de starka bistånds- och bidragsförordningar som finns i Norden att stödja till exempel sample translations. Och jag har en kollega i London som precis ska disputera en avhandling där hon har forskat i översättare av dansk skönlitteratur till engelska med det här invecklingen. Vad det gäller översättningen av Millennium till exempel, så skulle vi kunna prata om det, hur många timmar har vi på oss, men så absolut, liksom, det är ju klart att översättningen är viktig, för är det ingen översättare så är det ingen översättning, är det ingen översättning så har man ju ingen bok att sälja eller läsa. Men med Millennium till exempel så var det ju så att det blev ju en väldigt stark redaktionsprocess i Storbritannien för engelska utgåvan i alla fall. Så det har ju redan sagts till exempel att Smilla är ju egentligen engelska översättningen som vi har i Storbritannien är väldigt annorlunda till den amerikanska, och att den brittiska är egentligen en översättning av Christopher McElhose och Peter Hög hellre än Tina and Alley. Och man kan väl säga med Millennium nummer 1 att det är egentligen likadant. Det är en översättning av Stephen Murray, men sen är det kladdat över av Christopher McElhose och diverse andra på förlaget, och det fanns ju ingen Stig Larsson kvar som kunde säga emot. Så boken har blivit bättre eller inte? Det anses ju vara många problem med översättningen i Storbritannien med, men den är i alla fall annorlunda. Det kan man säga.
Ja, en sista fråga.
Dorte Nors känner du gott. Hon var ju hon på shortlisted till en stor pris.
Ja, Man Booker International. Ja, tillsammans med Roy Jacobson.
Var det har det någon inflytelse på salgstallene? Har det någon alltså hur mycket virker det på salgstallene?
Det är ju klart att det har ju givetvis en påverkan på försäljningen. Det kan det ju inte, och det är ju därför förlagen lägger på sina stickers på omslagen som säger shortlisted for the prize. Och jag blev till exempel kortlistad för International Dagger för 3 år sedan, och mitt förlag blev jätteglad, alltså de kunde säga nu är vi med på kortlistan. Men sådana här till exempel Dorte Nors eller andra litterära nordiska författare, så är det intressant att till och med de som vi pratar om väldigt mycket i den brittiska sammanhangen, och här tänker jag till exempel, jag har kollat på försäljningssiffror för Knausgård, för där är ju liksom storyn att typ alla har läst Knausgård. Det är ju skitsnack. Han har sålt ungefär 40 000 böcker i Storbritannien, och det är ju då, han har ju 6 böcker. Det är ju inte många folk som har läst Knausgård eller har köpt Knausgård eller har lånat honom, och det är detsamma för andra litterära figurer. Men sen att det är mer allmän kunskap för en författare och att det blir flera böcker, det kan ju stämma, för Dorte Nors var ju precis med i Guardian med en artikel på engelska till exempel, och det tror jag inte hade hänt för 10-20 år sedan. Så det blir ju mera awareness of the author, och då kanske man kan sälja fler böcker för översättning än som man inte säljer fler böcker i översättning.
Tack ska du ha en gång igen.